Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101. We have this stamp sketch here that I did when I was testing out my first trials with the fences set number 26. And the compositional element that I'm kind of dealing with this stamp sketch is we have so much open space in the road, so I'm trying to figure out if we can add possibly two focal points in maybe some hikers or something like that, something on the road, and maybe a quote stamp too. Okay, so I'm just using a standard kitchen sponge here, and I'm adding tones to my sky. I'll start off with that. And I'm starting off with a really light blue. It's a distress ink. I forgot what color this is, but it's a really light blue. Tumbled glass, maybe? I'm not sure. But one of the things about doing something that has a blue sky and it's going to have green grass is blue is a component of green, right? You add a little bit of yellow to it, and then you have green, or a variation of green. So to bring continuity to a scene that has those two different color fields in it, both green and blue, it's a good idea to bring some of that blue, or a lot of it, down into your grassy area. Okay, now what you see here is I'm leaving a little bit of white of the paper up in that sky, and I have some white within that grassy area. Okay, and that's going to give me a change in values, but it also, from an emotional standpoint, it gives me the light at the end of the road. Do you see how that curves around and it's light in there? Okay, now I'm going to add in a couple different components into that road area. So going in here with the antique linen, you know, kind of a light, warm brown tone. It's another distress ink. I'm going in and I'm filling in my road pretty good, but I am going to leave some light areas. So it's kind of like doing this thing I call spotlighting, except instead of using light, we're working on a white piece of paper, so we have to use contrast to depict lighting. So you can see where I've kind of oscillated my application of this brownish tone on the road. So there's areas that I've retained the white of the paper, just like I do the sky. So I'm doing that in all different fields, okay? So when people kind of get familiar with coloring, they see that road, and the tendency is to color it in uniformly. But what I'm doing is I'm just coloring it in kind of selectively, and it becomes not only coloring, but lighting as well, do you see? So you leave a little bit of white or a little bit of a lighter area in each field, sky, grass, and road, so you have both coloring and lighting at the same time, okay? All right, now I'm going in with a little bit of a darker blue. I'm not taking a huge jump, and that's what makes color blending very easy. If you don't make a huge jump from something very light to several values darker or to dark, let's say if I went in with a navy blue, you can do it, but it becomes a little bit more precarious because you're taking such a huge leap in value. Okay, so just using a different part of the sponge here, I'm going in with this bamboo leaves memento. It's a pretty warm green. Has a little bit more of a, it's kind of an olive green. Maybe a little bit more of a yellow in it than olive, but it's kind of that kind of earthy looking green tone, okay? So again, in this grassy area, I'm applying a color that's not too much darker than the blue that I previously applied in that area, okay? So see, it's very kind of dull and, I don't know, dull and light right now, okay? So just going on with another green here, it's more of, we're kind of moving towards the medium tones. And what I'm starting to target with my application of ink here is kind of toning in at the base of some trees because like a tree would provide shadows and, a shaded area in, if we're referencing nature and light. So I'm kind of filling in those areas. I'm going to try to retain some light areas. I'm not, working with this kind of sponge here, this big thick sponge, although I don't have the whole thing saturated with ink. It's getting a little filled in here, maybe a little bit too much, but that's okay because I can just alter the amount of darker greens that I use from here, going forward, okay? So even if you darken too much and say, oh my gosh, I lost my light, then just go, move to a darker green or even black and be a little bit more selective with that. And don't color in everything, okay? So if you color, things darker, then by contrast, anything that you've applied previously that's lighter seems even lighter by contrast, okay? So see, I'm getting a little bit more targeted in my application areas. It's kind of tapping like right underneath the tree. So you can see that variation in values within that meadow, and that reads as lighting, okay? Now later on in this video, I'll use some colored pencils, and it, just for more detailed coloring and shading, okay? Shadow development, you might say. Okay, so right here I'm kind of using a little corner of my sponge, okay? These are just, this is a quarter of a Scotch-Brite sponge, okay? If you're looking for tools to use, what you want to use are absorbent materials, because the more absorbent they are, the more liquid they take on, which is perfect for a liquid medium like dye-based inks, okay? And the first color, if I didn't mention it, I was using the re-inker ink so that I can get a really good saturation with that first blue. And this is another, I tend to go, I have a lot more distress inks in those kind of brownish tones, but I tend to use the antique linen, which is that really light one at first, and then I'll use the walnut stain, which is, I wouldn't call it a medium tone brown. It's still probably maybe a 30% value, in terms of the a value scale of, I don't know, whatever, 1 being white and 100 being black. Okay, it's still fairly light, but this walnut stain's a really good one too. But you see that green in there? It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of boring. It doesn't have a lot of like temperature changes in there, and it's more of a neutral green. It's kind of temperatureless. So I'm going into it now with browns, and I'm following up here with a Marvy brown. Marvy inks are going to be much brighter than a lot of other ink brands. There might be 1 or 2 colors in another brand that might be brighter than the Marvy counterpart, but just in general, Marvy is, I don't know, I'd say at least 2 times brighter for each similar color of other brands. They're just that way. That being said, I don't want bright everywhere, okay? That's why I use the distress inks, because they're kind of more aged and earthy looking. They're supposed to look very weathered, okay? And that makes a perfect complement on the intensity scale, okay? Intensity is the relative light and bright and dull of a color, okay? All right, so I'm going in here. This is following up with a dark brown. I use browns in my grass areas because it makes the grass areas look a little bit more natural and earthy than, something that looks, I don't know, too hot and vibrant of a green, you know. You add that brown in there and it kind of it mellows out the green, but it still has a greenish tinge, okay? So here's what the grass is. The grass is a combination of those browns of the road and the blues of the sky. See, it's kind of that, you know, middle, you know, um, link between those two areas, so that um, the ground and the road and sky have something in common from a colors perspective, okay? Otherwise, it would look very separate, you know. And I mean, that has its own charm to it, though, too. You can do those types of things where, you know, green never touches blue and, you know, brown never touches green, okay? And that has its own kind of look to it. I tend to do a little bit more blending. I just find it easier. I can get away with things much easier that way. I don't have to be careful and precise about anything. Colors bleed into things. I started to get a lot of fingerprints from the green because I'm touching that, you know, very wet sponge, so my fingertips got really green. So you can see some little smudgy green areas down in my road, you know, especially at the very base of it. That's why I started, you know, kind of holding my the card with my offhand with a paper towel instead of just my bare fingers. I need to do that more often. I don't know. Sometimes I don't even think about it, and I get like all these fingerprint smudges everywhere. But I do so much blending with colors and overlapping anyway, yeah, that it's not really an obtrusive type of look. And maybe even having some of that green in that road is, you know, good for, I don't know, kind of color continuity, I guess you might say. Okay, now I'm using black here. Now see, when I start using black, those areas in the meadow area and those rolling hills look a little bit lighter because I've gone so dark in a given area. Okay, so from a textural standpoint, we're going to use some of these, this design called Tiny Rocks. Okay, now see that light area in the road? I'm going to apply light values of this stamp impression in those areas. So what you do is you ink up your stamp and you start using it in some of the darker areas, and then with repeated stampings, you know, the stamp is getting drier and drier, so you're leaving a lighter impression with it, okay? And that's when I start using some of those rock impressions in the light areas when it's a very dry stamp, so you're dry stamping it. So it's kind of like an extreme version of shadow stamping, you know, where we used to stamp one stamp, then you offset it, and you stamp, you know, another impression of it, but it's lighter. Well, this one we might be doing 12 impressions off one inking, okay? Now this is going on with a darker brown. So see, I'm kind of staying in the darker areas with the darker brown. I bring it into some of those light areas, but maybe it's the 10th impression with it. But see those layers in there? This is the type of thing that you do with water textures, grass textures, in this case rocks, you know, pebbles on the road or whatnot. You utilize your ink to kind of its full capabilities. You stamp it in its full version, and second version, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. So you get all different values of it. And you can really get a lot more mileage out of each of your stamp pads that way. You don't look at just your black pad as pure black anymore. You look at it as black, 90% gray, 80% gray, 70% gray, so on and so forth, down to 0. So we usually don't think of our black stamp pad as a super pale light gray, but it can be just by using it in a drier tone. Okay, now I'm looking at this scene and it got very rich, you know, with rich brown tones on the road and there's rich green tones, but now the sky looked a little anemic to me. So what I'm doing is I'm going in with a brighter Marvy blue here, but I'm retaining some of the tumbled glass light tone. You know, I'm just not going into the scene quite as much. I'm just, you know, I'm kind of eyeballing it here. But do you see that where I've kind of used on the left and right edge? Now I'm going in with Prussian blue. It's pretty dark. But the paper up there is a little bit damp. So, you know, you're not getting really a full version of Prussian blue, or what it would look like, okay? When you stamp this Prussian blue on just a dry piece of paper, it's almost black, but you know that area up there is fairly soaked, so it's easy to blend in, and it's not applying a full saturation of that, which I didn't want. I don't want it to look, too dark up there, but I did want to get the darker values out there. Okay, now that being said, I thought, let's go a little bit darker because it kind of creates a little bit more of a stronger vignette that way, and it kind of closes off the top. So I'm kind of going into it maybe about a 1/4 inch, but then I blend in that 1/4 inch, and that's how I get that nice transition of that light on the horizon to the darker corners, okay? That's what this is kind of all about, is getting those transitions. You can see the transitions everywhere. Not so much in the grass, but you can definitely see where there's lighter areas in the grass and darker areas, okay? Okay, now this is a very pale pink, and this is what I was talking about, okay? That's a very bright, warm pink, okay? But I don't want that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it up in my sky just to give it a little bit of variation. But here I'm taking off most of the ink, so I'm applying probably a 5% version of an inherently light color. It's pretty bright, but see if you can see it. See, even a few swipes, it's barely showing at all, okay? That's what you want. That's the thing that people just are not accustomed to doing usually. So they think, oh my God, your process is, it's so hard, but it's not. You just don't, utilize hard techniques. You utilize very easy. You see that pale pink in there on the road? Look at that little tiny pale pink. It's like a powder pink that you're getting out of it. But people don't, and I understand it too, you're just not used to doing this at first, okay? People want full saturation, so what they do is they start inking on, and it's like, I can't see any pink at all, so they kind of press real hard and get this big saturated, pink that's harder to blend in. But just think of it that way, think about, when you start using it, like using like a 1% value of whatever ink you're using, okay? And just get the look you're going after through repetition, maybe 10 swipes or something like that. And then you never get anything, or there's less of a chance of getting kind of an unintentional mark, you might say. Okay, now these figures, the figure and the quote stamp, I'm stamping it in a VersaFine Clair, which those of you who have that pad, you know why I'm using it. You use the VersaFine Clair to get the darkest, crisp, most crisp impression of black that I think you can. I thought the Brilliance black pigment was pretty dark, and I thought the Marvy black was pretty dark, but then I did a comparison against the VersaFine Clair, and oh my God, VersaFine Clair is just so much darker. It takes longer to dry, and this paper here is, it's a white-coated silk cardstock, so it's a little bit closer to matte, but it is still sealed. So those two impressions are going to take a little bit of time to dry, so I need to be very careful about it. Okay, now, so I'm just showing what I'm doing here with the shadows on these fence posts, okay? And this is just your standard, black Prismacolor colored pencil. And by doing these shadows, and see that area along the road, in the impression, it's darker. And all I'm doing with this colored pencil is I'm reiterating that darkness along the roads. See how it gets a little bit more deep and defined in those hills in the background, the shadows underneath my trees here. You just use a little bit of I'm using Marvy Prismacolor black, but I'm using it like as a gray because I'm not pressing on it real hard. I'm doing a very light application of it. And you can get overall, you can get darker, but kind of lay down your gray tones first, okay? And then, see if you like it. If you want to go darker, then go darker, okay? But I like bringing it kind of all into focus in terms of the overall scene all at once, as opposed to, really developing one shadow of one fence post, you know, at a time or something like that. You get a little bit more continuity when you approach the overall that way. Okay, now I was thinking, we could use a little bit more of a kind of a, I don't know, visual lead in here with these reeds here in the corner. I don't want it to look like it's on the right on the road or something like that. Okay, so that was shading, right? Now I've taken the extra fine acrylic paint pen here. This one's kind of a tan color from Artistro. And adding those little textures on the road. Usually I'd use a white pen, but I have, you know, a set of these paint pens now. You can see, can you see all those little dots there? I start adding it in my light areas. So of course you use dark colors for your shadows in the darker areas, right? So you follow suit with highlighting. Highlighting shows up really well where kind of light meets dark. Okay, so I started off in the lighter areas. Now watch this on those fences. The fences look fine to me as is, but on the design I've drawn in, I've rendered highlights. So I'm going in and just reiterating the highlighting that is on the design, okay? So you don't have to invent things, you just have to look for where lighter things are on the designs, okay? I flip this around so I can access it so I don't put my hand in that wet quote stamp down there, okay? But see how much more three-dimensional things can look when you put a little bit of a highlight on them like that? See that that fence doesn't look like it's being top lit now, and it looks more three-dimensional. It doesn't look as flat. So when you look at designs, if you know, the more kind of three-dimensional you want something to look, you want that to be in the designs themselves. So I try to avoid silhouettes most of the time, and I draw in my volumes and textures as well. Okay, so I'm adding in some little highlights. They're a lot more subtle on these trees, but what I'm doing is I'm doing some interior lit trees. So the trees on the right side of the scene, I'm highlighting on the left side, and the trees on the left side I'm highlighting on, for the most part, on their right branches, okay? So it reiterates lighting coming from that horizon, you know, area at the end of the road. It's kind of a little bit more, you know, there's a little bit of a glow. It's a little bit more right side based, okay? Now I'm going into that meadow area, and where things got a little muddled and dark, see what you do is you just kind of bring in those little highlights like that, and it solves everything, okay? Now these are little, I don't know, it represents little lupin or something like that, you know, some wildflowers in the area, and kind of that violet and green, you know, is a pretty good color scheme. It's a pretty good color combination anyway, and you do find it out there in nature. Now look at what I'm doing here. I'm kind of grouping those flowers, okay? It becomes a real kind of, there's just something very instinctual. When we start doing these highlights, we want to like perfectly space them apart, like, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch apart, you know? But things often look better clustered. Okay, now this is the next day after I just let that VersaFine Clair air dry. I could have heat set it, but looking at the scene now, I was thinking, that grass, it's a little bit dull, you know? It was kind of temperatureless. So I'm going in with this warm green, pale, you know, green colored pencil. And you can see, can you see where it's, you know, becoming a little bit more warm and kind of inviting? I thought with the theme of the scene, you know, it's a happy scene, so warming things up within those darker areas kind of changes the emotional tone of the piece when you have warmth within a piece. Not that you can't have a, you know, some sort of very inviting, emotionally kind of engaging scene using all cool tones, but just in general, you know, we kind of follow the warmth, you know, we're drawn to it, you know, if we're in a dark night and there's a, you know, some kind of house or something with a warm light, you know, and a fireplace going in there, you know, we're kind of drawn to it emotionally. But that's also why I put that light on the end of the horizon. And, you know, if you see this kind of illuminated road going to, you know, somewhere, we're compelled to kind of follow it. You know, if it was out in real life or, you know, just from a visual standpoint, okay? So that's what I'm trying to create here. Okay, now I did something. You know, these little characters, they should really be higher up in the composition, you know, in relation to the fences. So I'm pushing them back in space. This is all a two-dimensional space and it's a flat surface, but I'm trying to create the illusion of depth here. So I'm putting them in a little bit of a blanket of kind of low-lying fog, and I'll put some of that, you know, the distant, you know, parts of the fence in a little bit of fog. And it just kind of pushes distance. It makes it look a little bit farther back. And plus, it creates this element of visual softness by adding in this, you know, cotton ball applied white pigment ink. Okay, now watch those trees in the background, okay? They look fine as is, but, you know, they're in that area next to the white, so I'm able to use this white over the top of them to represent lighting, okay? And now you have crisp trees kind of, you know, closer to us, and you have distant trees that are lighter. Now, doesn't that make those areas in the background look even farther away? So we've done two things. We've pushed distance, and we've also extended the kind of textural range of a piece. Everything was very crisp before, but now we have areas that are soft. So, you know, when you get kind of a tapestry of contrast and range within a given piece, be it hue, value, textures, intensity, temperature, you know, it can add to the visual richness of something, you know, when you have variation taking place. So that being said, I'm not putting this pigment ink over everything because everything would then be soft and I would lose that range. So we want some areas that are soft and crisp and both light and dark. All right, now I'm just looking at this and I thought, you know, some of those little flower areas, let's give those little flowers a little bit of change of value too. So pink is related to that purple, so in some of those purple areas I'll put a little dots of pink, and it just stands out a little bit more. Doesn't it look a little bit more friendly this way and happy? And that should about do it. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the scene, and hope you had fun with this journey of 1,000 miles beginning with one step.